I'm happy to introduce Ambassador Sepulveda, who's going to share his thoughts with us today on free trade and the open internet. And two stories have been in the news a lot lately. They have been free trade and fast track authority on one hand, and net neutrality on the other hand. And to me, there are a lot of complementarities in these two policies. The internet has been driving down costs to make this sort of production worldwide a clear role, but it's also here that policy plays a big role in what you can and can't do in these distributed systems and what trade is available, what intellectual property protections there are, and how you can do these kinds of efficient allocation of resources. So I'm glad we have Ambassador Sepulveda here to talk to us about what the administration thinks and is planning to do to try to facilitate this in the future and to make sure this symbiosis continues. So Ambassador Sepulveda is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and U.S. Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy at the State Department. I did have to write that down because I couldn't. Basically, that means that he leads the department and has U.S. communications policy around the world. He's worked as a senior advisor to several senators, including one who has since become president, but also Barbara Boxer. He's worked at the United States Trade Representative's Office and also in the Obama campaign. He has a Master of Public Administration from the LBJ School at the University of Texas and an undergraduate degree from Emory University in Atlanta. So he asked for a short introduction, so I let him talk. You'd rather hear him than me.
I look forward to having a roundtable discussion with you all, so I'm going to keep my opening remarks relatively short. Thank you very much for having me here. Wherever I go in the world, I try to do an academic visit. My father's an academic, my brother's an academic, and I have an immense amount of respect for academic institutions, both as a place of learning and as a gathering place for civil discourse. And in these issues of public policy that I've worked on for many years, 12 years in the United States Senate, and now 2.5 years leading the administration's efforts at the international level on these questions. There needs to be a civil space for conversation on these issues. So obviously, the importance of Stanford in this space is you can't over describe it. The number of people and firms and institutions and academic thinking that comes out of the region is obviously first rate and leading in the world. Everywhere I go in the world, including everywhere I go domestically, people ask me, how can we have a Silicon Valley here? And there's no simple answer to that question. There's no complex answer to that question. There's a lot of history that's fairly unique to this particular part of the country. There are other places that do similar things well, so the Boston environment and what they do around biotech, even in Oregon and what they're doing with advanced manufacturing and production. In Orlando, what they're doing around gaming and electronic arts and other things. But you get different clusters. And one of the things that we've been talking to people around the world, whether it be in Colombia or Africa or Latin America, India, is not to try to replicate what anyone else is doing, but to figure out what your particular advantage is going to be, or where you want to focus and where you want to cluster activity. So I'm here to talk predominantly about the relationship between our advocacy and work for protecting and preserving the single global open internet and how that relates to our advocacy and work for opening markets at a larger economic scale through trade policy and public policy in general. The state of the digital economy is that there are today 3 billion people connected to the network. That's an amazing thing. The rate of growth, if you think back to the 1990s and 1998 when ICANN was created, you were talking about maybe a couple 100 million people here in the United States and in Europe connected to each other, mostly at the academic scientific level with just really the beginnings of the burgeonings of the private internet. And today you have 3 billion people connected to it worldwide. My job is to pursue public policies as both an advocate and through treaty negotiations to ensure that we protect and preserve the underlying global nature of it. It's essentially private self-management. So if you think back to the telephone system, country code allocations were made centrally through governments and the International Telecommunications Union. Internet protocol addresses are distributed through a regional system of registries. That's a totally different way of going about it. In the internet protocol world, you interconnect on the basis of private contract that is sometimes a handshake of tier one interconnection with each other, or sometimes a negotiated payment, but it isn't subject to international treaty nor a model contract, as telephone interconnection is. On the protocol side, the standardization is all voluntary. So the Internet Engineering Task Force sets forward voluntary mechanisms by which networks decide to comply voluntarily with rules and protocols for interconnection and operation, as does the World Wide Web for operations on the World Wide Web. The World Wide Web Consortium sets the standards for that, and there are a variety of other private sector organizations. The telecom communications and standards were often set by the International Telecommunications Union. So what you have is this shift in how global communications works, which is decentralized, the power and authority over it and the actors in that space away from traditional governmental actors and regulators. The question then becomes, from an international perspective and a governing perspective, is whether or not the outcomes are just and legitimate. And you can have, and I have had, and will continue to have, many very long conversations on that underlying question and debate. As it relates specifically to trade and why it's important to that particular debate, the juxtaposition of opinion is essentially the United States in full support of the existing mechanisms for how the digital economy is managed and governed internationally, and China and Russia on the opposite end of the extreme. From a social perspective and some degree of economics perspective, you have the Middle East siding largely with Russia and China for centralized control and regulation over communications and how the operations of communications occur. And then you have everybody else in the middle. Depending on where you are at a point in the debate, Brazil and India could go either way. South Africa could go either way, and retaining them on the side of open markets, on the side of voluntary standards, on the side of the free flow of communications is critically important. So, and the whole corridor of the Southeast Asia is critically important. Your Koreas, Indonesia, that side of the equation, and the overhang that you have from China. Japan has always been an excellent ally. Australia has always been an excellent ally. Europe and the United States have historically always sat on the same side of the table. I am a little bit concerned about the proposals coming out relative to the digital single market, Mr. Oettinger's statements, and how we're going to proceed in that space. But I just came back from our annual Information Society dialogue with DG Connect out there, and feel pretty good, at least at my level and at the staff level, about the underlying uniformity of opinion on public policy among us as staff. Now the question is, how do we kick that up to our leadership and ensure that we continue the good work that we've been doing for many, many, many years together to ensure that the market remains as flat and open with as few barriers to entry and friction as possible. Mr. Wyden, who is our ranking member on the Senate Finance Committee, worked with Mr. Hatch and Mr. Ryan from the House to produce a Trade Promotion Authority bill over the last week. That is, I believe, a significant and important step forward in our general trade policy. It includes some significant revisions to the process by which trade agreements are constructed and delivered, including significantly greater transparency, a significantly greater role of oversight and time for Congress in the oversight of the process, and a couple of new negotiating objectives, including inclusion of consideration for the effects on the exercise of human rights as a result of any given trade agreement. Mr. Wyden has also said, and I think it is critically important to note, that he views the internet as the shipping lanes, the digital shipping lanes of the 21st century. That the way we used to think about keeping shipping lanes open internationally on oceans or over air, we need to think about it over wire and air for the transmission of information and data today. And the provisions that he has worked hard with my colleague Ambassador Froman at USTR and his team to ensure that the free flow of data and provisions within the TPP guard against data localization requirements and guard against discriminatory treatment against our e-commerce providers what that will mean for cloud computing in the world is critically important, and also what it means for ensuring that you have a bucket of nations, a very large one along the Pacific, arguing and putting their word and their name to an agreement to say, we believe in the underlying principle that the free flow of data should be protected in law and practice. That will be critically important when I go into international negotiations and take, for example, a China and Russia proposal comes to the table where they argue that actually digital sovereignty should rule, and that, as occurred at the last Plenipotentiary Conference of the International Telecommunications Union, India made a proposal that all internet protocol transmissions that originate in a country and terminate in a country have to stay in the country, that the providers of that communications have to keep a record log of that communications, and they have to be able to identify who it came from and who it was received by. All of that requires fundamental changes to the voluntary protocols that have been implemented by the Internet Engineering Task Force, and would require fundamental changes to how communications is designed and transmitted, and would be in fundamental violation of the provisions that we are negotiating in the existing trade agreements. So when a proposal like that is made, I can turn, hopefully after we sign the TPP, to our TPP colleagues and say, look, this is in contradiction to everything that we've agreed upon in the trade space. We can't agree to this here. It's bad public policy. And you have a greater alliance of countries, not just rich countries, but the TPP, one of the particularly important things about it is that it's a cross-section of both economies and political philosophies. So it's not just wealthy countries. You have your Vietnams and some South American countries, and it's not just traditional laissez-faire market countries, but you have, again, Vietnam and some other countries in that space that are committing to open markets, which I think is a very, very big deal. At the same time, we're working forward and moving forward with our transatlantic trade agreement, the TTIP negotiations, and that will move forward over time. And honestly, as this debate moves forward, and the president has been extremely articulate on this, and my boss, the Secretary of State, will be giving a speech later today on the relationship between trade and both the middle class and national security. And again, I was there for the 2002 Trade Promotion Authority debate. I was there for the CAFTA debate, and in both scenarios, what we as progressives argued for was enforceable provisions on labor and the environment relative to trade. We won. We have that in trade agreements now, and we've continued to make progress on progressive values as it relates to economics and international trade. And I think as progressives, we can lay claim to a strong internationalist tradition. It was Woodrow Wilson's famous 14 points. The third point was open markets. It was FDR who first asked for Trade Promotion Authority. It was JFK that brought us the WTO. It was Bill Clinton that brought us NAFTA. And it is Barack Obama that will bring us the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. I think that it is a tradition of progressivism and a tradition of believing in open markets, open societies, open engagement, and the value of commerce and the exchange of ideas as a democratizing force that unites all three of our public policies in favor of an open internet, a global open internet, in favor of open markets, and in favor of much more open migration public policies. And I don't see where the progressive values come together to oppose those ideas. So because I come from Congress and I know that there will be a real fight in the Congress in which many people with whom we are naturally aligned will disagree with us on this particular area of public policy. It's a conversation that's hard, it's a conversation that we need to have, but I'm very proud of my president for taking the initiative to do it. Leading on this issue for a Democrat is as hard as it is for a Republican to lead on immigration. And I think it takes an immense amount of courage, and our colleague, our Senator Wyden, is to be commended for his leadership on this space. But again, so there's a whole lot of stuff there that I just kind of threw out at you, and I'm happy to have a longer conversation about it. I think what's going on in Europe with their digital single market is fascinating. I think that the most recent debate in India around network neutrality and what it tells us about the injection into this public policy space that has happened in the United States and is going global of an activist base that cares very deeply about the internet, not just as a tool for economic progress, but as a tool for social progress, and as a, if not communally owned, if not a public good, certainly a public interest-based ecosystem in which they feel that they have part ownership and that they have a significant role to play in its governance and control. I think, again, that the Brazil and India, where they decide to go and how they decide to head, will significantly shape the relationship in the world and the degree to which we're able to isolate authoritarian regimes and their approach to the management of information and communications policy and trade relative to ours. And we are working very hard with India. We're very bullish about Mr. Modi and his team. India has 1.2 billion people. Only 200 million of them are connected to the internet. There are 3 to 4 billion people remaining on the planet who are not connected to the internet. You crack India, you've got 1/4 of them connected to the internet. That's a big deal, and it would have serious social justice outcomes. And we were working very closely with India. They have a Digital India initiative. They have 350 million people who migrate on a seasonal basis. That's like the United States of America moving around every season. And from a governing perspective, that's a really hard thing to manage. But if you have people's information in the cloud, you can deliver services to them, you can ensure that you know where they're going, you can make sure that kids are still connected to the education system, you can make sure that people still have digital banking accounts, and wherever they go, they can access public services. So I think that the Indians see that as critical to their responsibility in governance, and see an information communications infrastructure as a foundation on which to build a successful future, and we want to work to help that happen. The other interesting thing is that I manage and I'm working on our negotiations and discussions in opening up Cuba to technology and telecommunications services. While I've been here, one of the interesting meetings I did was with Airbnb and their initiatives in Cuba. I also met with Cloudflare, which is a company that helps people, and particularly NGOs, protect their websites and services from DDoS attacks and make those services dramatically more operational. They do it as a commercial business, but they also provide it for free as a service to NGOs doing social activist work around the world, which is an interesting service. And then I was here talking to Facebook and Google about connectivity issues around the world, as well as the specific public policy challenges that they face around the world. But with that, I'd like to open it up to conversation and see where y'all want to take it.
Great. Thank you very much. You want to start, Daniel?
Sure, absolutely, Mr. Ambassador. Thanks. We really appreciate what you're doing with Microsoft. The fundamental question I have is relative to the national sovereignty and security issues, international inflow, internet, and one word, sort of encryption. How do you think those three things play together, and how do you think we'll do?
Well, so this area of international commerce is kind of unique, right? I mean, in the physical space, every country has a recognized right to inspect and deny or grant entry to a physical product coming into the country. In the digital space, that's not the case. And we don't believe it should be. Our colleagues in Russia and China have called for a concept of digital sovereignty to be adopted by the United Nations, in which they argue it is the nation state's rights to determine what digital information can enter and exit a country and how it's managed within that country. Now, we believe that's incorrect, because when you talk about the transfer of information, you're not talking about the transfer of goods, you're talking about the transfer of ideas. And that it is a basic human right to be able to engage in the exchange of ideas without a government telling you that you can or cannot do that. So how does that relate to the encryption debate? As you see, the president came out here and he had a cybersecurity conference here and gave a pretty public interview on Recode. I don't know if you haven't seen it. I suggest that you take a look at it, in which he talked about his support for strong encryption for a variety of reasons, largely because it protects people's communications from criminal enterprise and other things. By that same token, he talked about how law enforcement concerns relative to communications that were once accessible, not being accessible because they've been moved over to encrypted services. From a governing perspective, you essentially have a variety of options. What we've tried to do is to create a space for cooperation and collaboration with industry, particularly the owners of infrastructure and services, about how we can put our best minds together to solve what we agree is a problem. So we're working on the assumption that our friends in the technology community don't want their services used either for the advocacy of extreme violence or terrorism or for criminal enterprise. We don't want those services used for that. So if you work off of that basic premise, then you can create a space in which to determine whether or not there are engineering, political, or policy or legal solutions to address that challenge, and whether or not you can isolate that degree of communications or negative activity, much in the same way that you've done with child pornography. The problem becomes when you get either side of a debate arguing that the other side is malintentioned, right? So if there are folks in the tech community arguing essentially that the Obama administration or governments want to make technology companies the agent of the state, right? That's loaded language. And if on our side, or from the government perspective, if people start arguing, well, technology just wants to enable terrorists to communicate with each other, again, it's not conducive to a cooperative and collaborative framework in which to have a discussion. Mark Zuckerberg wrote a book called, well, he didn't write a book, he has a book club, and the first book of the book club was called The End of Power. And in that book, Moses Naim, I think, is the author, talks about how people in positions of power, whether it be corporate or governmental, have had to deal with the fact that their power is no longer as powerful, right? There used to be a time where a government regulator or law enforcement agency could just turn to the technology industry and say, you're going to redesign your services so that we can access the information, and that's the end of this conversation. And that's just not how it works anymore, right? And getting to a place where we can have, where we're sharing responsibility, basically social responsibility and authority as a private sector and a public sector, it implies new needs for, and we're working through this in terms of sort of co-regulation or cooperative mechanisms for problem solving that aren't control and command traditional regulatory mechanisms for problem solving. And I think that this is one of the spaces in which we're going to have to find creative ways to get there. Yes, sir.
An issue is kind of a follow-up. You said about the physical products. There's been a recent dispute with China about inspecting Cisco's boxes and similar concerns on Huawei boxes coming in. But it's a more general issue. I mean, how
Sure.
can we have free trade when different countries are demanding to look at all intellectual property to make sure there aren't backdoors and there aren't holes in the encryption?
Well, that feeds the premise that that's why they're doing it, right? The Chinese government recently came out with a proposal on cybersecurity specific to banking and the banking sector, requiring banks in China to purchase domestic either hardware or software on the basis and grounds of the argument that it's as a function of a protection of security. Cybersecurity is a real thing, it's a real threat, it's not made up, but we have to find non-trade restrictive ways of doing it, and we can't allow traditional protectionism or traditional, import substitution strategies to hide behind the veil of cybersecurity. The Chinese clearly thought that they could isolate us by placing this argument under a security veil, but the European Union and the European private sector came out in opposition to that regulation and initiative. So did the Japanese. So they've suspended that for now. But you see this argument being played out in many markets around the world. And oftentimes it's really a demand for domestic production. So, and it doesn't solve your underlying problem because you've only affected one threat vector in what is a panoply of threat vectors. So even if you took it seriously as a security concern, it isn't a solution to your problem. But we do have to work cooperatively to ensure that the underlying problem that is real is addressed. And we have constructed a model here in the United States, and the president and his team have worked through a negotiated compromise on information sharing as the basis for the best mechanism for cybersecurity protection in the United States. And I think that's a model that we can help sell around the world.
How do you, sort of following up on that, the United States has, my recollection, has banned or made it hard for Huawei to bring boxes into the United States, and presumably China would say the exact same thing to us. And how do you respond? I know when I was at the FCC, oftentimes I would say, go around to people around the world, and they all say, well, the United States, you tell us what to do, but you're doing something very different.
Yeah, I mean, threats or assertions of hypocrisy are just kind of part and parcel of how negotiations are conducted in this space. Our public policies, which are the most obvious of which is CFIUS, the CFIUS process, are security-based and they're targeted and narrow. So we don't have an industrial policy for the construction and protection of our domestic producers. Right? We do have security and national security processes through which specific imports of specific things are judged against our intelligence acquisition and knowledge. When entry is denied, we have good reason. We have very good reason, and we're happy to take that anywhere they want to have a conversation about it. And we've taken it to the WTO on multiple occasions, and we've won on multiple occasions. Yes, sir.
How do you feel about the Export-Import Bank?
We support the Export-Import Bank and the work it does. I think the U.S. Chamber of Commerce does as well. There's a general consensus that it does good work. I'm not an expert on the subject. The only thing I know is that it's become a political hot potato in Washington, but it historically hasn't been. It's a relatively new development. I think the underlying argument that it's a form of corporate welfare is an interesting one. Maybe all incentive programs and government initiatives are a form of corporate welfare. That doesn't, by definition, make them bad. So, yes, sir.
Where will the United States come out? I mean, we're still debating. I know we've passed bills. Perhaps I'm not uninformed, but where will the United States come out in its policy of free markets versus controlling various internet policies? We haven't quite reached our conclusion. Is that right?
No. We are, in the first instance, as it relates to speech on the internet, we have the most liberal speech allowances and laws in the entire world. And I didn't realize this until I started traveling around the world and talking to other people, how liberal our policies are relative to freedom of expression. And we will stand by that area of public policy. In terms of when you talk about the internet, you're talking about a lot of things. So you have to talk about the technical layer, the physical layer, and then everything that rides over it. We have been clear that the content layer is a form of expression, a form of transmission that not just from an economic perspective, but from a social justice perspective, we believe should remain unregulated. There is a move and a concern by some that we have first comer advantage and have captured markets in some specific areas. So you see that argument coming out of Europe and other places, and we will counter those arguments. And those are arguments that were considered by the FCC in the net neutrality debate, and the FCC affirmatively rejected them. What the FCC decided to do as it relates to the open internet is to protect people's access at the point of access to the internet, not the internet itself. And ensure essentially that no single actor, not the government, not the terminating service provider can control what anyone on the internet does or does not do. I don't know if that answered your question, but yes, sir.
So to sort of follow up on the CFIUS point, so how important is sort of internet governance, maintaining a free and open internet within sort of broader policy decisions the U.S. makes on cybersecurity, for instance, where you see to some degree, some friction, right, when certain decisions are made related to surveillance or related issues, and then you get blowback. I would assume that sort of feeds stereotypes and Snowden disclosures and everything. So I'm curious, sort of the internal policy making when you say on the one hand we're trying to protect the free and open internet, but on the other hand we may need to do things that could then jeopardize that internationally, or at least make it a little more complicated. How do you balance those equities and take into account sort of the competing?
You have really contentious meetings at the White House, right?
Can you explain CFIUS before you, not everyone here.
Again, I'm not an expert on CFIUS, but I have been in CFIUS meetings where essentially a transaction is being presented that the intelligence community has a concern with. It's a foreign transaction in the United States, and then the agencies decide whether or not to allow that transaction to occur. But it's specific to a given transaction, and it's more often than not, you can put in mitigation procedures to keep that the particular purchase from being blocked. As it relates to what do you do when you have any public policy that contradict or makes it harder to transmit information over the internet across international borders, or implies a regulation of activity on the internet, right? We try to ensure, the way we balance that is to try to ensure that to make it as tailored, as narrow as possible, and as defensible as possible from a public interest perspective. Not just our public interest, but the global public interest. Right? The most difficult thing that we've had to deal with from a public relations perspective, from an international public relations perspective, has been the Snowden disclosures. I have spent, and myself and my colleagues, Assistant Secretary Strickling and others, have spent an immense amount of time with the intelligence community trying to understand what it is exactly that Mr. Snowden has disclosed and what exactly it implies for us and our image abroad, and what can and can't be done. The president put together an external review committee of experts who do not work for the administration to put forward recommendations for changes to our practices. The vast majority of those changes have been embraced. The president I worked for him in the Senate. I know him personally. I know what his motivating factors are for being a public servant, and civil liberties is, if not the number one, it is among the top reasons why he went into service. It's an animating force. So it's very difficult to go around the world and just take it, and I do. I go to Germany and I get yelled at. I go to India and I get yelled at. And it's just part of the job, right? But by that same token, I've spent an immense amount of time with our colleagues at NSA, and I've spent an immense amount of time with our colleagues in the security community, and I'm convinced that what we have in place and what we're doing for the right things and under the correct and proper mechanisms for providing checks and balances on any abusive potential. So my job is to convey that abroad and to explain the reform process that we've gone through. But again, national security is really something very unique and separate and apart, and for which there are exceptions in almost every other area of law that we have. Every trade agreement has national security exceptions, and it is obviously the first responsibility of government is to provide for the security of the nation. But it is challenging. My family is originally from Chile, in Latin America, and we left, and I have family who were affected by the dictatorship in Chile. So the power of government relative to the individual and the role of government relative to the individual's rights in the state are, hit very, very close to home. And I have cousins who, over Facebook or a phone have told me what they think about the Snowden disclosures. And the fact of the matter is that everybody in the world has very, very strong opinions about what Mr. Snowden has disclosed, without having a full understanding of either exactly what it means, putting it in context, or understanding how we've responded to it as an administration. Now, you can understand all of that and still think that we're wrong, and that the very collection of people's information is in and of itself a violation of their dignity and should be denied by international law. Okay, we disagree with that. right? And you can and will have very long conversations about it at the Human Rights Council and in forums and think tanks around the world. And that's part of the deliberative and democratic process of discourse and debate that we're going to continue to have. Yes, sir.
So, I'm going to take an extreme position,
Okay.
but it seems to me, that'll be the first time. It seems to me we're operating on the assumption that commerce, terrorism, and cybersecurity are independent of one another. And one of the things that has happened because of the digital economy is that we have completely integrated terrorism, cybersecurity, and commerce. And from my point of view, the greatest threat to my personal liberty and my greatest concern for the security of this country is that those systems have become so tightly integrated, and that what we are doing is proceeding at a very rapid rate on enhancing the commerce side on the assumption that at some point we'll catch up on the cybersecurity and terrorism side. And I think that we are making vast, rapid advances in cybercrime and cybersecurity that we are completely underestimating.
That's interesting. In the first instance, the convergence of the use of the single network by all actors is what you're pointing to, and that's not a natural phenomenon, but it's an organic phenomenon that has happened in the market that we didn't dictate or control.
I agree.
So if there were different wires and spectrum for terrorists to use, we would certainly isolate that. That doesn't happen. They use the same, essentially, communications infrastructure that everyone else uses. We have like you said, we have made significant progress and are investing a significant amount of money in cybersecurity and cybercrime prevention. And not just us as a government, but the private sector is as well. I just did a visit with Cisco and I was at RSA, and the number of companies that are being generated to meet the market demand for the protection of networks is phenomenal. It's actually a testament to the market system. And once you've seen the market system responds essentially to what is a failure in the markets, and you saw that through the data breaches and hacks that have occurred over the last 2 to 3 years. But now you have C-level attention at major corporations, and you have general level attention at like people with stars on their shoulders at the government, and then presidential level attention as well on these issues. And that's driving both investment, time, and attention and expertise into solving these problems. Now, at the same time, we are driving and will continue to drive the power of commerce. And commerce is just another word for the ability of human beings to exercise their ideas and innovation and fulfill whatever potential they have using this revolutionary mechanism and tool. But it is a tool, it's a technology, and like any other tool and technology, it can be used for evil just as well as good. What we're trying to do is maximize its use for good, which includes commerce, while at the same time addressing the costs that are associated with it. But it isn't a zero-sum game. Yes, ma'am.
Can you comment on cryptocurrency? Is there a State Department view?
There may be. I don't know what it is, though. Cryptocurrency, I'll have to admit, is a little bit outside of my mathematics understanding and is relatively new. But I know it's important, and you're not the first person to ask me, so I should probably study up.
Just to follow up on that question, isn't there a strong argument for a closed internet?
No, there's not a strong argument for a closed internet.
Tell me why there isn't.
Tell me what it would be.
Well, just the
I mean,
idea that-
China has a closed internet. Can you make a strong argument for China's internet?
And I'm not arguing for one, I'm just trying to understand the arguments on the other side of the question. You express the arguments on the open internet side very well.
Sure.
And I generally agree with that. But because of those concerns in that question, having more barriers for the transfer of information where people are looking at what's being transferred and being able to build systems to control that for the right reasons, like we try to look at stuff for our right reasons. Isn't there an argument for that? Why isn't there? I mean, how do people make that argument? Or do they make that argument? Is there a reasonable argument on the other side, I guess is another way to ask the question.
There are arguments on the other side, and the most common arguments are made by Russia and China relative to their ability to protect their regime, right? So what you're trying to protect is political stability, and what you're trying to protect is political power. From that perspective, if your interest is in the protection of a specific person's or a specific group of human beings' political power, yeah, there's a very strong argument for a closed internet. That is just not, that is not only the basis of American values or anything we would ever encourage or enable, but it contravenes and contradicts internationally agreed upon human rights. A much more difficult case is relative to religious expression. So when I go to Indonesia or when I go to India, or where people have laws against the threats to a person's religious expression, or there are certain things you specifically cannot do and say relative to the Prophet Muhammad. It is a more difficult and challenging argument to say, well, in America we believe that negative or hate-related speech can be countered and should be countered in an open market of ideas, and that you shouldn't work to block the expression but counter it. That becomes, because you're not really talking about corrupt political power, or you're not talking about the denial, well, in some sense you are talking about the denial of a person's freedom of expression, but in a balancing sense, from their cultural perspective. And that is a more complex and difficult conversation, and it's actually a conversation that companies, because companies are the platforms and intermediaries through which that expression occurs, have with governments all the time. It isn't brokered or negotiated by us as a government, but those conversations happen, and as private enterprises, they show differing degrees of sensitivity to the markets in which they're operating, and I think that, personally, I think that that's the right thing for them to do, but we don't tell them whether to do or not do that. They have, under American law, the right not to do that. By that same token, the countries themselves have a right to block their services, and do when they find them in violation. We push back on that action. So when Turkey blocked Twitter, for example, and that was, to our mind, a violation. One, it was communal punishment, even if it was against the law for a specific person to put up a tweet and then block everybody's right to tweet. But beyond that, the kind of tweets that they were determining to be objectionable were consistent with our understanding of what is enabled under internationally agreed upon freedom of expression rights, and even under Turkish law, which the Supreme Court of Turkey came back and said was true, and Twitter came back up. But they do have that's an example of where the government and Twitter eventually have come to a mechanism by which to deal with concerns of the government and much more open communication systems going forward.
What were the themes that they were blocking?
There was a taped, and I'm trying to remember, but there was a taped conversation between two parties that implied that the president of Turkey was engaged in some either corrupt or illegal activity, and that tape was being retweeted out and out and out and out. Again, from our perspective, that's not illegal. Even when many of the things that Mr. Snowden is in Russia for a reason, the disclosure of the things that he did was in violation of American law, but we don't punish people who replicate what it was disclosed. They have the right to do that.
I'm sorry I came in late, so you may have covered this, but how does the government feel today about the likelihood of an all-out attack, a cyber attack on our power and communications and so on? How easy or difficult would it be? How much protection do we have to block that? Because it's so many different aspects. It seems to me almost an impossible job.
It's predominantly the responsibility of our Department of Homeland Security and our Department of Defense. And we also have put in place multiple information sharing mechanisms through our cybersecurity officials for the owners of critical infrastructure to be able to continually communicate with the government and with each other about pending threats. It's somewhat outside of my area of expertise, but I do know that we have.
What is your feeling about how strong the government is in this respect?
I haven't, I mean, again, these are my colleagues, and I have an immense amount of faith in the work that they're doing. But it's not a sufficiently educated piece of knowledge for me to make a credible case for it.
Yeah.
What's your sense of just the impact to economic growth relative to the degree a society tries to control the internet? You know, if you start saying, we'll shut off Twitter, shut off Facebook, and access to that, and think forward 5 years, there must be a pretty significant frictional cost to growth. But
yeah, it's interesting because both McKinsey and the World Economic Forum have done studies on this very question. So they look at two like markets and compare like markets who are open and connected, or who are connected, and then markets who are connected and open. And you find that everything else being equal, a connected market grows at a certain percentage rate faster than a not connected market, and then above that, all other things being equal, a market that is connected and open, in the sense of not imposing friction on commerce, grows at a faster rate than that. Which are studies that we take to my counterparts around the world that are regulators and policymakers and try to present to them, and they read them and they take them in good faith, but it's going to take it coming from a place that they view as legitimate for them to embrace as a public policy going forward. So we've been trying to work with the OECD, which does have some degree of legitimacy in much of the developing world, particularly as Latin America tries to enter the OECD and others. We've taken it to the World Bank, and we've taken it to what we're trying to do is find more voices that will be heard around the world on that particular question. And you'll also find people that, who will say, well, okay, I'll take a 2% hit in GDP if that means that I can control, what comes in and out of my country.
So following up on that, you talked about 3 billion people being connected in the world, but that means 3 billion people aren't.
Right, and those 3 billion people aren't connected equally. Like, there are a lot of people who are connected over wireless networks, and that's not the same as being connected over a wired network. But yes, and there's still a lot of work to do.
So when you say there's a lot of work to do, does that mean there's a role for the U.S. or for developing countries, or how should people think about what is the global impact of that, and what role should anybody be playing, what are we doing, if anything?
I mean, we all have different roles to play. So what government's role is to create a legal, regulatory, and policy environment that enables and encourages investment in networks within a given country. To the degree that you want to see egalitarian distribution of service, is going to require some degree of cross-subsidization. So you need universal service funds. We have them in the United States. We have them in most of the developed world, and our USAID programs help other countries set them up in their own country. We also need to drive down the very costs of the delivery of services. So some of the investments being made in unmanned aerial vehicles as a mechanism for the deployment of services, work around unlicensed white spaces and the deployment of networks over those, as well as there's interesting work in that, and then work being done to drive down the cost of devices that enable people to connect to the service itself. We're going to have to continue thinking about what you do as you hit the hardest to connect. There are 2 billion people who live on less than $2 a day and have more immediate concerns than paying an internet subscription bill, and they just don't have the money. How are we going to ensure that connectivity reaches them? In the first instance, you have to decide that it's necessary. So this is no longer a luxury good. And you can see it in parts of the world. For example, in Africa, significant numbers of people who've never been banked now have a banking account through their mobile phone. You're seeing in the informal sector, the small sector in Mexico, for example, you own a taco stand and you haven't historically been banked or formally a part of the economy, but because of digital banking, you become a part of the economy. Through access to digital health or access to information for agricultural purposes, you're dramatically more productive. And we're seeing local innovation and local initiatives to use this technology in ways that wouldn't occur to us because we don't have the same needs. So to fight illegal phishing, for example, in parts of Southeast Asia, people have created a cell phone network by which they're distributing information and sharing when someone is in violation of phishing laws. Those sorts of things are really changing people's lives. So the idea is and if you look forward to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the next phase of the Millennium Development Goals, ICT and having, for example, having everyone in the world connected to broadband is not one of those goals, but it would be an enabler of all of them. So it's an enabler of ensuring that people get an education, that we end poverty, that women have access to opportunity, that youth employment occurs. And getting a component under each of those goals and a joint governmental commitment to creating an environment that furthers those goals is a big chunk of the work that I'll be doing over the next year. But we do have to start thinking empirically. There are brand new challenges. So we were talking earlier about where the physical and the virtual, world meet and what that's going to mean for production in the delivery of services and the distribution of services. So what does Airbnb mean for the hospitality industry around the world? What does obviously Uber mean? But beyond that, what does 3D printing mean for traditional distribution mechanisms, or even taxation or import laws around the world when you can just print something that you would otherwise tax at the border or deny entry to, right? There are a whole host of challenges that the network, as it becomes more powerful, imposes on policymakers, and also as connectivity doesn't reach populations that are already living in disproportionately difficult circumstances. So if what we end up seeing is pockets of connectivity in the developing world where wealth already exists and an exacerbation of inequality, that's not the goal, right? You want ICT to be a force for creating wealth for everyone and not exacerbating inequality, but bridging it. And so that creates immense amounts of challenges, not just for us, but for the private sector. And it's really going to be up to the private sector to provide the cost solutions here, which is why I find it encouraging. I know that there's a self-interest, but I also think that there's a public interest in the initiatives that the investment that's being made in lowering the cost of the delivery of communication services around the world.
I was curious if you could elaborate on Cuba and some of the
Oh,
work
yeah.
you're doing there, and given the relationship with Russia and others who may not support freedom of internet, how that dialogue is going.
Right, I went to Cuba. I was the first topical person to go. That is to say that our ministries of foreign affairs were talking about how to open embassies and whatnot, but I went down and meet with their Ministry of Foreign Trade and Investment and their Ministry of Communications about how our tech and telecom firms could do business in Cuba. And what I learned was that it's very, very highly controlled, very centralized. So there's a very specific mechanism. They want you to go to the interest section in Washington first, present let's say you have a proposal for a submarine cable from Miami to Havana. They want you to go to the interest section in Cuba, talk to people, tell them we have this proposal. They'll look at it, they'll listen to you. They'll go to the Foreign Trade and Investment Office and say, are we okay with this entry of a foreign participant in our market? The Foreign Trade and Investment Office will decide, well, I guess. And then they'll say, okay, well, what ministry is responsible for this particular area of our economy? The proposal will then be transferred to them. In this case, it would be the Ministry of Communications. The Ministry of Communications would determine whether or not it meets their strategic goals in this particular sector of the economy over the next 5 to 10 years. If the answer to that is yes, then that will be transferred to whoever would be the executor of whatever is necessary to interconnect with a submarine cable coming from Miami. That would be a TEXA, which is their telecommunications. So to get from a proposal to yes is going to be a very, very long process, but at least we can have the conversation now, right? And I found, this is a very, I grew up in Florida politics. I know how emotional the Cuba question is. And so I hesitate to speak too much about it, but I'm very hopeful for it. I know that it's changed the way significant numbers of our colleagues in Latin America think about us and our relationship to the world. And having been in Cuba, it's like seeing a house that is a fixer-upper, and it just could be amazing, right? It has all of the underlying foundational things necessary: a well-educated population. It's relatively easy to get around. It's beautiful. It's well located geographically between the north and the south. So it's really a question of changing the dynamics of our economic relationship with them. And we have fundamentally different ideas about how you organize an economy and society. So we're talking about a journey of 1,000 miles, but we have taken that initial first step, and it's very exciting. And we've done this trip, and my goal is on a future trip. And I'm a policy advocate. I'm not a commercial advocate. Like, I don't go around trying to cut deals for people or broker deals for people. But what I do want to do is take some thought leaders from the tech and telecom community down to explain how different platforms and different communication systems act as an enabler of economic development across sectors. So what could this mean? The Airbnb example is a perfect one, right? So they allow casas particulares in Cuba, which are small. You can buy a home and rent it out. That's allowed in Cuba now. And it's only 2 or 3 years that that's been allowed. And what does Airbnb enable? It enables those people to do that better and become wealthier at it and more successful at it. That's the power of technology and telecommunications when you're not the owner of technology and telecommunications, is as an enabler of other things. And selling that, even things like Facebook and Twitter, how can then the Casa Particular owner use Facebook and Twitter to maintain a relationship, an ongoing relationship with people who want to come to the island on a regular basis, or talk about improvements to the home or any other mechanism. But you kind of have to humanize these services for public servants around the world, because public servants aren't technologists and they're not in love or enthralled with technology itself. Their passion is public service. So what you have to do is sell how these things enable them to do their job. And a big part of that will be taking people down and letting them be their own advocates, right? Because having been out to Silicon Valley and heard people, I became sold on the power of this part of the country when I worked for Barbara Boxer and came out here and saw the excitement that people had about what they were going to be able to do to change the world. Now, you have to let them sell that around the world, because I don't know enough to do that for them, right? So that's kind of what we're going to be trying to do going forward.
One last question.
Just a rather quick question. You had mentioned earlier, I believe, that the United States is making efforts in connecting the billions of unconnected people in India. Do we have similar efforts in Central and South America?
We do. We have something called the Alliance for Affordable Internet, which is a public-private partnership, and they, in agreement with a given government in any part of the world, do a wholesale review of the legal policy and regulatory infrastructure of that country and what it would take through a discussion and negotiation and comparison of like markets to improve conditions there for increased connectivity. And there are markets in Central and South America where we're doing that, in Africa as well. We also have a series of capacity building efforts that we're doing around the world for both regulators and the private sector in that country to help increase their ability to serve their populations. I was just at Facebook yesterday, and Facebook has an interesting connectivity initiative that they're doing with Ericsson to help regulators in a given country understand the quality of the network in that country and where the choke points are and what they can do to help relieve them. And that's something that we're going to try to advocate around the world that people access as well. But the scale of the challenge, I mean, billions of people, we're not going to connect billions. We don't have the money or the political support to build networks and operate them for people around the world. All we can do is create an environment where they can do that for themselves.
Great. Well, at SEPA, we have a tradition of ending on time, so I want to thank Ambassador Sepulveda very much. And also, I want to make the observation that as a very good State Department employee, he has 2 phones sitting there, so I think that's good too. So thank you very much.
Thank you.